changing the measurements a little bit, what we're measuring, how that's sort of inevitable, why we would poll, a little bit of math around polling. We talked about standard errors. No one took the bait and wanted to go into the math bit. That's fine. It's complicated math. But what I normally do in lecture, I realized earlier, sort of, I got cameras early today. I was up at and I realized that my normal lecture focuses on the polling information that's in the book to talk about the content of American public opinion right now. But the book's out of date. It's not like radically out of date. Like, that's a publication process. You can all have to learn this. Like, here's peer review, looking over it. This is a publication process. It means that all the information there is pretty good for when it was published, but isn't actually the most current. And since I already talked about sort of why we poll, how we poll, what the sort of forces are that shape public opinion, we talked a little bit about like how ideologies are created, right? We knit together these ideologies, or political actors knit together these ideologies in order to sort of gather up party alliances. What I thought we'd do today is we just pull up like actual contemporary polls and go through some of the most important polls at the moment. So we can talk about like, what is American public opinion right now? Where are we at as a nation? So I'll say, it's not normally the way I do this, so this might fuck up. Like, this might work really badly, and we might have a kind of train wreck. If so, I apologize. I don't think so. Like, I think that it'll be super straightforward and be interesting. But I also want to save the lag. I've done this before, therefore this might work a little poorly. Right now, there are lights on here, but not there. I think it would make more sense to switch them. Is that probably sensible? Yeah? All right. I'm going to ask for a couple of things. I don't know how this group works, like at all. Front, back. Well, touche. Good, good. Okay. All right. I mean, there's so many light switches. Why not play with all of them? Right? You got toys, let's play with them. Alright, pardon me, I guess it's fine. Alright, 2 light switches here. You want to see what these do?
Yes.
And now there's a whole other bank over here. Who wired this idiot place? I don't know. Maybe these aren't even light switches. I gotta flip one of these and light a fireplace or something. We'll figure it out. Alright, we're just gonna go in order here. Nah. Everyone does. Look at me. Very well. Sorry. Ah. And? You like that? Should we keep it here? Can folks in the front, like, and I assume there's enough light for you all to, like, be able to see what you're doing, those of you who are on, so okay. So, Gallup, let's talk very briefly about Gallup. Gallup is one of the sort of central polling organizations in the U.S. It primarily does polling. It makes its money by licensing its polling, by selling its poll working services to various organizations that would want to perform this service or want this information about like what people think about things. Other important outfits to know, Gallup is one of the important ones. Pew Research is also very good. I think that their website is a little bit less user-friendly, which is why I'm not using that. But like, they're also very well respected. You can get to them. There are a couple others that are pretty good. 538 has excellent start from the beginning there. 538 has excellent data visualization. So I think that they do a really good job of presenting data. But also their data is not as sort of classic. Like 538 has a fairly quirky angle even after Nate Silver's departure. Nate Silver and the Silver Bulletin has really interesting stuff if you are a crazy person about evaluating a quarterback play in the NFL. But if that's not where you're at right now, Silver Bulletin actually is sort of like mid, I think, for political polling stuff in particular. Other things to be aware of, Rasmussen does a very good job polling. They have a very consistent House lean of about 2.5 points for Republicans. So weirdly, in almost everything Rasmussen puts out, their polling is absolutely, it's like wonderfully good polling that just always is consistent 2 to 3 points off to the right side. They're the only house I can easily think of, by the way, that's not a partisan house. When I say a house, I mean like a polling operation. They're the only house I can think of that's not an explicitly partisan one that has a GOP lead. This is actually really important to know. Most polling organizations in 2025 have a Democratic or sort of vaguely left-wing lead. I wouldn't say like super progressive or anything like that. But they have a sort of vague democratic lean. Pollsters are not entirely sure why. The working theory that most pollsters are using to help explain why this is the case is that right now, this is something that will come up in the actual polling data itself, one of the dominant parts of the current makeup of the right coalition is a populist right. A populist right is characterized in part by serious mistrust against elites, the contention that there's a shadowy elite of hapless college professors like me who are attempting to sort of guide the world in a way that is disruptive to true Americans. And there's a populist right, by the way, and a populist left. Populism is not something that exists only on the right or the left. But populism is a sort of anti-elite, vaguely conspiratorial take on whatever sort of ideology you're in. Right now, the populism is ascendant on the right. It's complicated on the left. It's both ascendant and sort of in trouble on the left. But populism is really sort of ascendant on the right. And what that has meant in the eyes of a lot of pollsters is that folks who have right-wing sympathies or lean politically to the right are just less interested in engaging with pollsters generally because of this sort of anti-technocracy, anti-elitist stance. The idea that oh, these are all made up bullshit anyway, I'm not going to deal with it, I'm not going to answer the phone. We don't know that that's the case though. And we don't know that's the case because when you talk about non-respondents, when you're trying to figure out what's going on with non-respondents, you always have to make guesses. Why don't you know what's going on with non-respondents in a poll? We'll get to kind of polls in 10 seconds. But why don't you know the content of what's going on in the head of people who don't respond to your poll? Yeah?
You're not getting any information.
Because they're not responding to the poll, right? It's sort of definitional, right? They're the folks you're not getting the information from. That's how they're non-respondents, and therefore you don't have any information to determine why they're not responding. So you're just making guesses. A lot of polling involves making certain kinds of guesses. Polling involves polling is a technical skill, and as a technical skill, it combines elements of sort of technique with a certain amount of judgment and artistry. The same way that almost any technical skill in its actual real-world application has to involve someone who has to make little adjustments and figure out how to do things, right? Surgeons have to figure out how to cut when they actually open you up. Same kind of thing with pollsters. Okay. So I pulled up a couple of, this is very neat. So Gallup has a bunch of unpolling topics and trends that we can just go over. And some of those are super duper interesting. In fact, we'll start with weather trends. Okay, here's one of my favorites. Until relatively recently, abortion was the signal issue, the central issue that proxy for America's culture war. It's not the only one, but it's been a long time one. It's a perfect sort of a culture war proxy issue because it involves questions of sort of family formation, questions of feminism, questions of queer identity, and sort of sexual autonomy, all bound up together in a fairly straightforward policy question. Under what circumstances should abortion be legal? I think that this is fascinating because for decades, this question has been, not I think most recently, we'll get to sort of why that's dropped off in a second, but until the past few years, this has been sort of the question that's defined American cultural politics. Lots of people have died over the answer to this question. We've seen a fair number of political assassinations taking place over the answer to this question. So you would expect then, presumably, to see that Americans are wildly far apart on abortion. That a lot of people think that it should be available under absolutely any circumstances, and a lot of people who are really deeply committed to the idea that it should be acceptable under no circumstances. And as you can see here, that's not what we see at all. It's actually kind of shocking. Just looking at this poll, and this is now a question as a way of checking to make sure you know how to read the poll. What percentage of Americans in 2025, the most recent year we have data for, what percentage of Americans would want to ban abortion in all circumstances? 13%. How many Americans, what percentage think it should be legal under any circumstances? 30. And how many Americans think it should be legal under only certain circumstances? 55. Does this look like a chart of an extreme nation? Does this look like a chart that's riven by polarization, where people are literally killing one another over the answer to this question? Is that what this chart looks like?
I thought we were supposed to look at the standard errors too.
Well, I would love to be able to look at standard errors. We don't have the standard errors immediately with us, but because we know that this is a well-respected polling outfit, and by the way, get the data, we can pull this up, and we can see if they just list their standard errors out. They might. They're a good polling outfit with strong methodology. They're not ashamed to show us what's going on under the hood. So we can probably click here, and I can see whether it's going to be raw data or whether it's going to be processed data. But we know that this is a well-respected polling outfit. Therefore, we know, because of that, reputationally, it is highly likely that the standard errors are, in fact, quite standard ones. Which means, does anyone have to remember about what that would be? Yeah.
2.5 to 3%.
Yeah, on both sides. So you're looking for about somewhere, about a 5 percentage point. That's usually about right. About a 5 percentage point split that's centered on that 55. So the percentage of Americans, it's great to remember the standard error. Thank you for doing that. So the percentage of Americans that think it should be legal under any circumstances is probably not 55%. It would just be unusual for it to be like actually happen to be 55% dead on the nose. Instead, it's almost certainly between 52% on the low end and somewhere around like 58% on the high end. Importantly though, so that means 30 would go to like 27, 22, and 13 goes to like 16, 10, right? Roughly speaking. Importantly for this step, do we get any lines crossed because of those error bars? Are there any moments, right now in 2025, where the error bars overlap with one another? They don't. And so we have very good reason to think that while these trend lines might not be absolute, they're at least, we've got everything tiered out in the right way. Like we've got everything sorted in the right way. Once we get, by the way, you'll notice that from like the 2000s to the 2010s, there was a prospect of error bars here actually overlapping, where you couldn't tell whether more Americans vote one way or another. That's interesting to see. But right now, 2025, I don't think we see this. So it's a good reminder, but I think we can still largely trust this data. People want, in a minute or two, I'll click on get the data, we'll just see how the process it is. If it's super raw, we're not going to do anything with it right now, because I don't think anyone wants to calculate standard errors right now. If it's not super processed though, and if it has some information, we can see what's going on. Okay, does this look like a graph of Americans who cannot agree about this? Does this look like a graph of Americans who are at one another's throat about this issue? To me, it doesn't. 55% of Americans are somewhere in the middle. 30% of Americans on one side, 13% on another side. This is almost a bell curve with a slightly larger tail on the pro-abortion rather than anti-abortion side. This graph on its own I find fascinating, because what it suggests is that we have the experience of highly polarized politics without having a lot of actual polarization going on in our beliefs. And it's worth thinking about why that would have been the case. But it's not this graph alone that's my favorite graph in the abortion stuff. Instead, it's this graph combined with this graph. I'm going to scroll down. Let's see if I can keep both of them in. Yes, I can. I love it. Does this graph look like a polarized graph? Yeah, it looks much closer to a polarized graph. You have two sides that do not agree with one another, pro-choice, pro-life. There's no third option or something in the middle that's given. And you'll notice that these are very close with one another. We get a little bit more separation here, right around, looks to be about 2015, 2017. We get a little bit more separation, but before that, they're all the way through. But I find this graph, in light of that graph up there, fucking wild. What are some fucking wild things you can see in the comparison of these two graphs? Yeah?
Words matter.
Words matter. I love it. Say more. Yes, absolutely. But like, be more specific.
You can see how you use aspirations.
Yeah. The way this gets phrased clearly is changing something.
To add to that, I feel like under certain circumstances is very broad and very subjective of whoever's answering. You know, when given just two choices, it's either or.
One thing, and this is keying up on exactly what both of you are talking about, I'm just going to use slightly different language to talk about it. 13% of Americans want to ban abortion. 43% of Americans describe themselves as pro-life. 30% of all Americans, both, describe themselves as pro-life, and want abortion under at least some circumstances. That's a fucking wild outcome, right? When I think of pro-life, that's not the position I think of. When you hear pro-life as a position, what political policy do you associate those words with, or that position with?
Total representation and no like extenuating circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, we can imagine sort of very minimal ones, maybe exceptions in case of like rape or incest, but in general, when I hear pro-life, what I hear is abortion restrictions, no no opportunities for abortion in a broad sense. But 30% of Americans are both pro-life but support abortion in a bunch of circumstances. And I think it's worth asking, not in a hostile way, but in an inquisitive way, what's going on with that? 30% of Americans, by the way, is a lot. That's a third. That's a huge number of Americans who identify, and I think that's part of what's going on, who identify as pro-life, for a policy that doesn't necessarily regulate abortion in all circumstances. Yeah, please.
I was just gonna say, like, it's both lines that are going up, so it's probably just the gray area part, like the legal in some circumstances. It's just like, just depending on, it could go under like any category, so it just splits it up.
It might be really useful to disaggregate those circumstances. Let me ask you, as people who are politically awake in America, I don't mean both, but like are paying attention and it makes sense to politics right now. If you want to disaggregate that top poll here of these 55%, see how nice that is, right? If you want to disaggregate that top poll of 55%, how might you pull it back? What are the subcategories you think would be useful in trying to sort out, okay, what's going on with that? Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's right. I think that, at least to my mind, the subcategories I would want to pull out is first, I want a subcategory of people who are exceptions for rape and incest only. That's who I want to pull out first. And I want to pull that out first because it's very easy for me to imagine that those are the Americans who find themselves in that 30% who identify as pro-life, but do not necessarily support in an automatic way pro-life positions. The other thing that I would want to look at, besides like, maybe you extend that to like health and safety of the mother. So you have just rape and incest, then that plus health and safety of the mother. And then I would put a time thing on it. Because my guess is that you could get a lot of analytic purchase, you could get a lot of information out of separating out that 55% in when they think regulation is appropriate. Traditionally, Americans are far more supportive of regulations around abortion later in a pregnancy than early. So that would be the other thing I wanted to segregate. One thing I want to point out from this stuff, and this is a super important thing to point out, is that this is asking people how they identify. That's asking people what policy they want. Notice that there's an imperfect match, right? There's a deeply imperfect match between how people identify and what policy they want. That's not unusual. It's not unusual. It's not just about abortion. I think abortion does a great job of highlighting it. 30% is a bonkers high number. Like, that's a weird finding. That should, if you're in, like, if you give a shit about that stuff, this sort of stuff, you should look at that and be like, wait, what on earth is going on here? Because that's a big gap. But this is just a set of things that shows a big gap. People's political identities and their policy preferences don't always match up neatly. And that's just a feature of American life, that people will affiliate with an identity community without necessarily that affiliation coming with identification or preference for all of the sort of various policy preferences, even just when you're talking about an identity as restricted as this. The coupling, the connection between policy preferences and identity is shockingly loose. And that's what I really want to get across with this set of polls more than anything else, because I think it really illustrates the looseness. I would assume that virtually everyone who identified as pro-life would want significant restrictions on abortions. I've seen, like, I'm not going to present it right here because it'll take too long for me to find, but I should say, I've seen some of this data disaggregated. I can say, it's not the case that all 43% of these are like, no, I support regulation of abortion in virtually all circumstances, just not in a narrow circumstance. It's much broader. There are a bunch of Americans who think that abortion should be legal, though they would prefer to be rare, up through the middle of the second trimester without a lot of regulations. And Americans, the same group of Americans who would be supportive of at least some opportunities for abortion very late in pregnancy under very restricted circumstances. And these are a bunch of folks who have that position but identifies pro-life. I know this because I'm friends with a bunch of people like this. And a bunch of my friends both identify as pro-life and also are supportive of legally protecting abortion rights in a bunch of circumstances. And because I want to maintain my friendships, I don't press them on like, oh, you're being so hypocritical. But I know it's not hypocrisy, but rather an imperfect ongoing relationship between identity and preferences. That's all that's going on. Yeah?
How do you think the results would be different if they swapped the order of the question class?
I don't know about this. Oh, I really want this actually. There's a very specific set of polls that I really want right now. That is not how I want to do that. I'm sorry, I'm fussing about because I'm hopefully going to answer exactly this question. Okay. So I'm going to try and answer exactly this question, but without another portion. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Like I'm assuming that you have a structural question really rather than about abortion law portion. So we'll do this with this instead because I was very happy to see that you did this. This is going to show up really strongly. Okay. Do you think marriage between same-sex couples should or should not be recognized by law as valid with the same rights as traditional marriage? First of all, what do you see here? Like just someone describe the graph in a big sense. Yeah.
Huge dip towards the middle on those sides.
What's that?
There's this big dip towards the middle.
Yeah. So the early 90s, most people oppose recognizing queer marriages as equal. By the time you get today, most people, it switches from about 2/3 against to about 2/3 in favor. And there's a very obvious switch point. Somewhere here around 2010, you see a big set of changes, both in an increase in support and drop off for lack of support. Why is that happening, by the way, in 2010? We can talk about a whole bunch of social issues, but there's a specific stuff that happens right around here that matters. Does anyone happen to know? Yeah.
That one they legalized.
That's when they legalized it. That's right. And I'm really glad that you recognize that because it's important to see that the Supreme Court is not always a trailing indicator. Sometimes it's a leading indicator. There are times when people will oppose it until there's legal protection, and then they're like, oh, fine, now there's legal protection, so it's fine. So you get an acceleration of the switch exactly at the point where the Supreme Court recognizes it. Not because the Supreme Court is following public opinion, but the Supreme Court is in a small way shaping public opinion. There are some Americans who are uncomfortable with this until there's official sanction for it. And then as soon as there is official sanction, they're just like, oh, okay, well, I guess this is law. I like following the law, that's to death. That suggests, by the way, that there are a bunch of Americans whose answer to this question is not driven by any particular beliefs about the queer community, but instead about law itself. Right? There's some folks in here who are just legal conservatives. They just don't want to see the law change. And then once the law changes, they want to see that regime preserved because they just have a formal preference for stability. And that's a thing that you can just see in the data exactly in this trend line around here, which you successfully identified. So, first of all, and let's look. If you pay any attention to American politics around this issue, this graph will not surprise you. It's exactly what you would expect. Gradual declination, gradual increase. But you had a question about framing effects, whether question order matters. I'm so glad you asked this. And if I'm honest, I'm so glad I looked it up earlier today. First, we're not going to get a pretty grasp. We're going to have to look at numbers. I promise we're not going to do math. Just to see number go up, number go down. That's all we're really looking at here. Okay. Do you think marriages between same-sex couples should or should not be recognized by law as valid with the same rights as traditional marriage? And then there's a subheading. Someone read the subheading out loud.
Trend in which gay marriage question preceded by questions on legality of gay/lesbian rights and relations.
Exactly right. And this is getting at this issue. We know that framing effects matter. Question order matters. The way you parse something matters. as you said earlier, words matter. I asked you to say more about this, not because it's wrong, but because there's too many different things that are contained in this. It is absolutely the case that question order matters. We're about to see, actually kind of dramatically, how much question order matters here. I want to show you, and then we'll stop and talk about why it would be the case that question order matters. What's going on psychologically that makes it matter like this? Okay, so what do you see here in the numbers? Like, I don't need anything precise, just like roughly what are you seeing in the numbers here? First of all, do Americans in general think that queer marriages should be valid or invalid? What's that? Valid, yes, valid. What's the split very roughly? Huh? 70-30, yeah, it's about 2-1, right? It's about 2/3 of Americans think that queer marriages should be valid, and 1/3 of Americans should not think that they shouldn't be valid. Now, incidentally, I would pay money of my own, not a lot, but little money of my own, to find out how many gay people said that they should not be valid. Because it's not going to be a small percentage. I'm really curious about that, because that'll give you really interesting information about the queer community, both about conservatives in the queer community, and there are, like, as it turns out, like, human sexual preference doesn't track with politics the way you would think, so there are actually a lot more spiritually conservative folks in the queer community than you would think. Probably not many of them are in this, I'd be curious. There are also going to be a bunch of radical queers who say basically, like, marriage, I want to get into that burning house, like, marriage is doing terribly right now, why should we get out of this? I'd also be curious how many homophobes go and these should be valid, because why should queers be any happier than the rest of us, they say? Why should they get out of marriage just by having it? There's probably like 1 or 2% is here. But keep in mind, you can get a couple percentage of points of Americans who agree about just about anything. The lizard man constant is understood to be somewhere around 15%. Does anyone know what the lizard man constant is? If you ask any population, hey, do you think the world is run by lizard men? 15 or at least 15% will be like, oh yeah, probably. So, I guess get on Polymarket and set your buzz down. Okay, so if we precede questions about gay marriage with questions about the legality of gay rights generally, you get about 2/3 in favor. But, the question you asked was extremely smart, and Gallup knew that was extremely smart, so they have it there here. Trend in which gay marriage question is not preceded by questions on legality of gay and lesbian rights. Now we've got counts here for 2000 to 2005. So this is going to be not my favorite thing. Here's how we'll do this. Just for a second, let's make these smaller. So I have these next to each other in the appropriate years, just so we can actually see things a little bit head to head. I realize this is taking a quick second. Thank you for your patience. Absolutely not. Right. Here. Okay. So it's 2005, 2000 to 2005. Okay. So very roughly, I think I've got these about lined up sort of towards the top. So the relevant ones then are here. And those are, well, those are, you can match this up yourselves. What do you see in the data? I'm just giving these highlighted because these are the relevant ones on this side, but all the ones on this side are relevant. What do you see in the data? Again, this is not like, I don't need precision, just like bigger number, smaller number. This is not a math class. What do you see? I can tell you what I see. Would that be helpful? What I see is that this number, with the framing effect, is consistently a little bit bigger than this number over here without it. Right? It's not 10 points different, but it is consistently different. Look, we need to get out the error bars and figure out whether or not these actually are meaningfully distinct numbers. But like the math is there, we can do this. Here's what I'll say. Given the consistency of the pattern across them, if it's within the error bars, that's a little weird to see that, like, at no point do they cross signs, that, like, this is always consistently a little bit higher. So even if it's in error bars, I'm not sure I think it is, right? 2005 May, we got 45% support over here, and 2005 April, May, we've got 39. That's 6%. That's probably outside the error bars, right? We got 28 in 2005. Oh yeah, so that's in March of 2005. We got 28%. Over here we got 42%. That's 14 points. That's probably outside the error bars. And so look, we need to bear down and like actually do math, and we're not gonna do it right here. Don't worry. But like my strong sense is that you're getting something like 5 to 10 extra points. Probably closer to 5, probably 5 to 7 extra points of support through the framing of whether or not the question is preceded by questions on the legality of career rights generally. That's, I think, about what you're pulling on this question. Now, different questions, you might not see any change, you might see much larger changes. This isn't necessarily going to be a constant pattern, and we don't have an algorithmic pattern for exactly how to tell this. We have to go to the empirics, like you have to just do the measurements and see what the difference is. But we're not surprised to see a measurement difference here. And you'll notice that this was such a good question and such a good thing to point out. The Gallup already had the shit organized this way because they knew that this was going to be important. By the way, the fact that they didn't do this with abortion is at least suggestive that abortion might be a little less intensely affected by framing, right? The fact that they already had it set up suggests to me that this is a place where we see much bigger, more obvious framing effects and question order effects than in other things. Does that make sense? So I know that this was, look, I want to go over these charts. I was so happy when you guys said this. Great, I love it. Next time we're just going to plant this in a with the student and have it play out. Okay. So, yeah, question order really matters. Also, by the way, you can see the flip happen here really straightforwardly, right? We can actually tell basically when it happened. It happened sometime in either 2009, 2010. But like right then is when that happened. When was the big gay marriage case decided? Someone look it up. I should know it, yes, but I don't remember the year. It's right around, here's what I'll say, it's like right around here. So we'll just look it up real quick. Yeah, you got it?
Same-sex marriage was legalized,
2015.
yeah,
2015?
yeah.
Wow, that late? So it's a leading, so in that case, the court is well behind public opinion. You'll notice something happens here around 2009, 2010, and not until we get here. That's a pretty big jump, I would say. 58 to 63, that's a fairly sizable jump. That's 5 points. Like you can see, if you look at the data, it's noisy. There's movement around, but that's one of the larger jumps. Yeah.
So you can say the portion of the population is the legal system before they're on their own.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't separate them out exactly that way. What I would say is that for a certain percentage of the American population, it seems that adherence to existing legal law, to existing laws really seems to matter, and that that's a relatively high priority. I don't know what's higher priority then. They might not see this as a moral issue, right? If you're a straight person, you might not see this as a moral issue on a whole bunch of ways. If you're a gay person, you might not see this as a moral issue on a whole variety of ways. So I think we have less information about what they don't think, but I think we absolutely are getting a little bit of information that there are some people who are just sort of legally conservative, not politically conservative, but legally conservative in the U.S. I do absolutely think we can see that. Yeah.
One thing to remember though with this in particular is that gay marriage had been legalized by certain states, starting in the 20.
Starting like 2004, yeah. Hawaii goes very early. You get some movement with Gavin Newsom up in San Francisco relatively early.
Massachusetts legalized gay marriage in 2004. That was the year.
Great, good. Yeah, Massachusetts was the government. Like, I went through all this, but of course there was such a, well, the other thing that's in the background, so absolutely yes. The other thing that's also in the background, so a state-by-state breakdown and trend line, which we don't have right here, but that would be super cool to be able to see, like, is it the case that those states that legalized were the legalizations leading, trailing indicators? That would be really cool to see what the distribution was. Was it the case that legal states made bigger changes than cognate non-legal states. So like Massachusetts is very liberal, but so is Connecticut in its way. Why does Massachusetts move in Connecticut not, for example? Why does Massachusetts move in Vermont not? That would be really interesting. I would love to see a map. The other thing is that there's also, at the same time that all this is going on, in the lead up, really starting in the early 2000s, you're starting to get civil unions and a whole patchwork of sort of arrangements for and against civil unions for queer couplings. That, I mean, sort of really early, in like the 60s and 70s, you have adult adoption, which is what people use. But then, for obvious reasons, there are problems with that. And so you start to get to these other baskets of goods, but you also get these civil union protections, which kick in at Hawaii quite early. I think even in the 90s, we're getting some level of civil union protection. So it'd be really interesting to see like whether those help convince the legally conservative Americans that this was okay. To see a map of the breakdown and to see a map of like in each state whether there were big changes that corresponded with big changes in the legal system and the legal regime. That would be really interesting. So yes. So I really want to show you abortion. I think that one was really interesting. I really want to show you gay rights because I'm going to go over this issue, which is a big one. But what I also want to do was to just spend some time on what you want to see. What trends do you want to see? We just got a trend line that they want to see. Don't worry, I've got a bunch of interesting ones picked up. No one has an answer, but I think you might. Yeah.
I'm curious about
Cloning? Shit, yeah. Cloning scares me because in the Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition manual, it specifies that if you ever cast a spell clone, and your clone, which takes a while to cast, several years, and your clone comes to life, the two of you will instantly be stricken mad and will have to seek one another out and destroy yourselves. So, you don't normally hear a lot about my politics. It's just a spell, it's just D&D.
wait, what class?
What class? It's a wizard spell. That's 2nd edition. Anyway, so cloning has always scared me. But sure, cloning, why not? All right. Is it morally acceptable to clone animals? This is interesting. What do you see here? I haven't looked through this data at all, so I'm looking through this with you. But what do you see in this first one? They're super low percentiles, right? Like, let me just ask in here. We're going to do a quick informal poll. This will work better. I'm not going to put a Kahoot or anything. I get prepared. I put together, by the way, my first Kahoot earlier today in my night class, and that shit takes forever to do. I was super annoyed with it. So for those of you who have put these together for class presentations before, you have my admiration. That was an incredible pain in the day. I'm not going to put a Kahoot together for this. But let me just do a straw poll in here. Do y'all think it's morally unacceptable to clone animals? Are you like, that's just a sin against nature? And how many people in here are like, I feel strongly, or even like notably, that we should not clone animals? Put your hands up. There's no shame in it. I just want to get a straw poll. Notice how few hands there are. Which is not to say that this is like, it's just, for me, 34% seems really interesting. This is somewhere I'd like to get a map as well, because I suspect that this is distributed very unevenly across the nation. Does this number, 8% for cloning humans, seem about right to you? Yeah, that seems about right. There are questions underneath this. Now I'm really curious. Learning together. All right. Do you see any trend line in this data historically? By the way, I don't. Right? It seems pretty straightforward. Like, again, 2/3, 1/3, which is kind of wild because there's been huge advances in cloning technology over this time. And the fact that we haven't seen changes in people's evaluation of it, despite the fact that we've seen, actually, in the context of cloning, like radical technological change, that's a little weird. Like, that's just a surprising outcome. So I feel myself surprised by that. Okay, cloning humans. Yeah, I mean, I guess. You know, the folks in 2018 seem to think that that was a better idea than today, I guess. But in general, like, this is the same thing. Like, this is noisier, but you should expect that, like, when you get really small things, like, in general, small stuff is often very much noisier than big stuff, the changes tend to even out, whereas in the small stuff, big change, like small changes just show up more when you're talking about small numbers, like, for obvious reasons. Yeah, when you talk about small numbers already, relatively small changes just show up more than when you've got big numbers. So I wouldn't read anything into these. This looks like a random walk to me. And again, that's interesting. Voting technology has changed. We haven't seen any changes. This from 2003. I'm not sure if that's. Is there anything interesting here? Oh, okay. Something mildly interesting here, I think. It seems like, to me, that there's something interesting going on in that endangered species, to keep them from becoming extinct, and human embryos for use in medical research, those are about the same number. And human organs and human cells are about the same number. They're not exactly the same number, but they're about the same number. And this makes me wonder whether there's basically clustering going on. Whether there's a cluster of like 15% of people who will kind of favor it, or, well, okay, there's some amount of people who are just in favor of cloning, like 8%, maybe 10%. There are a number of people who don't like it for humans, but are comfortable with it, pets. And then there is an increasingly large number of people who are comfortable with it in sort of specific kinds of circumstances. And to me, this suggests a kind of conceptual clustering around, like, these are okay uses of cloning, these are not. So that's how you interpret this data. Okay. I'm looking for cloning. Yes. Well, here, if you go to the all trends as well, is there anything here under, look at abortion? You should look at immigration at some point. But is that what you want to look at now? Yeah. We're going to look at immigration. There's no, we were always going to look at immigration. We're looking at immigration because, no, that is not what I want. There. We're going to look at immigration because immigration has in many ways replaced abortion as the central proxy for a culture war reflected politically in the U.S. This has happened coinciding with the first Trump presidency, although it's not necessarily, like the causal arrow is extremely complicated in this connector. We're not sure whether Trump was very good, had a very effective media message, and was able to bring it around immigration as a wedge issue, or whether there was already folks who were really steamed about immigration as a lurking wedge issue that Trump was able to capitalize on. We don't know. One thing you can see is that these numbers do in fact change quite wildly over time. It's not entirely obvious why though. Look at some of these trend lines. Okay, 1985, we get a big increase in desire to decrease levels of immigrants that last basically until 96. What's happening in 96? We get a crash.
There was a sharp increase in border conflicts.
Okay, what's happening politically? National politics.
Is that what happened?
No, NAFTA is before that. NAFTA is early 90s. I would say I'm genuinely not sure. I find this very, very, very challenging data to really make perfect sense of. We do get a big jump up here in, I think we can actually find the year, because I think that this is not a piece of shit. Okay. So in June 2024, we get a big jump up. Hey, what might that coincide with? Okay, sure, but what else? Yeah, presidential election. The presidential election is what's going on. And I find it really interesting that basically, we go from 30% to 55% in the course of 4 years. And I think that there's information there, especially because we can see that trend line is a continuous trend line. Right? It's not just one bump here, one bump here, but rather it's fairly obvious that something, I don't like the way this looks, it's fairly obvious that something is going on to cause consistent measures over the early 2000s to show greater support for deportation. And then, by the way, immediately after the election, it falls off, which is also kind of wild there. So, this chart on its own, it has a lot going on. That's not what I want to show you in immigration. Okay. So, this is basically the numbers that go into the above chart. It's exactly the sorts of things that you would expect. That's not what I want to show you. Okay. It's a good thing. Notice, by the way, that the number of Americans who think that immigration is in general a good thing for the country is consistently much higher than support for actually letting immigrants in. That is, there's a very big gap between what people say in this abstract sense is a good policy and what they want concretely. Again, that shouldn't surprise you. I see some surprised Pikachu faces in the audience. And like, yeah, sure, that's right. But like, this is fairly common in Poland. Again, people's identities and their policy preferences don't always match up perfectly. People adopt identities largely as a communal strategy, as a way of connecting with the people around them, as a way of making friends, as a way of making themselves sensible in social interactions with other people. But what that means is that identity is in many ways a strategic choice, rather than just a proxy or index of your various positions. Like, you make a choice about how to present yourself in the world, and that those choices do not necessarily line up with the baseline preferences that you have, because identity is a set of choices you're actively making. Okay, so this is a wild graph. See that from some of the surprise faces. You think that's a fun graph? The next set of numbers is also, to me, really interesting. Let's break down preferences around immigrants by race. Okay. If you hadn't seen the numbers, you did see the numbers, but if you hadn't seen the numbers for Hispanic adults, what percentage of them do you assume would strongly oppose deportation of all illegal immigrants? If you haven't seen the numbers, but just asking back. Hispanic adults, what do you think? What would you say?
My guess is like around most half, maybe more.
Here's what I find really wild, is that the strongly oppose is exactly in line with the other group's measure. Right, like it's not literally the same number, but it's the same, it's basically the same number, right? 35% compared to 33%, that's the same number, it's in those error bars. 35% compared to 31%, non-Hispanic white adults, the most conservative demographic in the country, at least on here. The one most likely to vote Republican. The one most likely to be in favor of immigration restrictions, not abortion restrictions. Strongly oppose, 31%. Hispanic adults, 35%. That's in the error bars, that's the same number. Where do you see the big change among Hispanic adults? Where's the big difference between Hispanic adults and national adults or non-Hispanic white adults? Put black folks aside for a second. I mean, I just mean for this polling results here. What do you see in the comparison between like this line and the 2025 line? I'll tell you what I see. What I see is that there's a chunk of people who do not strongly favor, but instead oppose. But notice it's not strongly oppose. That really matters. Because one thing you can tell is that if it's not as strongly opposed, one thing you know about that person is there's something out there they strongly oppose. Right? There's a thing out there that they strongly oppose. Part of what they're doing is they're measuring, is my opposition to this more or less than the other oppositions I already feel? And so it's really interesting that it's not strongly opposed, because the fact that these numbers are here, not here, represents a really obvious political opportunity for the GOP. What it means is that a party could successfully campaign against immigration, and as long as they're counterbalancing that, which some Hispanic folks strongly oppose, as long as they're counterbalancing that with stuff to to make sure that the opposers can still go on board. Not the strongly opposers. These folks are not going to get on board. Strongly opposers not going to get on board. But opposed, you can buy off. Someone opposes a policy. What that means is they don't like the policy, but they're also signaling, like, I can be bought off. Not bought off in the sense of, like, I will change my view, but just like there's other stuff that matters more to me. You can get my support through other policy stuff. The fact that these big numbers are here, they're more in opposed rather than strongly opposed. That signals a certain amount of really important, what's the right word to use here? Nuance in what the Hispanic community thinks about immigration. If you wanted to use this chart to talk about the past few elections, it would be very easy to point at this and basically say, the Democrats fucked this up. The Democrats misread the leads. They thought that the big numbers in opposed were in strongly opposed, and so they thought that there would be greater opposition to immigration coming in from communities that overlap with the immigrant community. Imperfect overlap, like we're using broad demographic questions here, but like Democrats clearly thought that like Hispanic voters were going to be much more strongly opposed to immigration restrictions than they are. They're opposed. Democrats were directionally right, but missed on intensity. And that really matters. Because when you only have two viable options in the voting booth, you're already making trade-offs, right? It's very unlikely that you're ever going to have a moment in your life, as an American at least, where you enter in a voting booth and there's a candidate, and you look at that candidate and you think, yeah, that's exactly who I want to hold office. It's a country of 330 million people. Politics is the art of compromise. You're going to be making compromises in the voting booth every single time. That's the way it goes. And here, this data was showing there's room for a compromise here. There's effective room for a compromise there. Compromise was struck. And what you now see, and I'm not going to pull up this data right now because it's going to take me too long, but what you now see is that there are a bunch of pro-Trump Hispanic folks, or pro-Trump Latino folks, who are like, perfect example, second generation North End units. Father started a business when they came in, they inherited that business. Those guys are much closer to the Midwest auto dealership owners in terms of their voting patterns than they are to like a colleague of mine, for example, who is Latino. Like, those guys are just far more, from a political cultural standpoint, they're far closer to sort of the Midwest petty bourgeois dude who is the center of sort of MAGA than they are to a bunch of like the Latino community here in LA. I mean, it's not, but they are part of the Latino. It's just the Latino community does not necessarily look the way we always think it does politically. Yes.
Right. So Hispanic adults who are on the opposed side are very much like on a seesaw where their opinion can get swayed all the way up to strongly favor, whereas the strongly opposed are just off the seesaw.
I don't think that you can get these guys to strongly favor. But what you can do is nullify their opposition by giving them some other stuff. I don't like Trump about this. I think he's going too far. But fill in your, Biden was too old. But I think that the tariff regime is good. But he's cracking down on drugs, and I like that. It's not the case that you're, and this is a really good question, you're not moving people out of here to another category. Actually, at the end of the day, it's not even clear from a political standpoint you care about that. Right? You just care about the vote. What you're doing instead is you're saying, if you oppose but don't strongly oppose, that means you're listening. Right? That means if I make a pitch, you might hear me. Strongly oppose is just not going to hear me. Strongly oppose is just like, nope, this is not where I'm at, I'm just not interested, like, when you're in strongly opposed, this is the kind of issue you might vote on. But when you're just in opposed, you see some reasons that you can be moved up. You see some trade-offs that you can make. That's why it's really interesting to see that gap here. And I know I'm really sort of hammering away on that gap. But like, it's actually a super important gap. That gap is probably more important than any other gap here. The gap between opposed and favor, it's not necessarily a lot you can do with that. The gap between favor and strongly favor, like whatever, these people are probably on your side anyway. But that shows real weakness in sort of the democratic presumptions about a permanent democratic majority coming from sort of demographic change in the US. Are people following all this? I want to just check it. Like, I'm trying to explain. Again, like I said, I haven't done this way before, so I just want to get a sense of how people are acting. Okay,
So this is one of the big things I want to show about immigration, which is that immigration attitudes do not necessarily line up with the identity characteristics that you might think they do. People's identity is more nuanced than that. As I'm sure everyone here is already aware, but I want to sort of say in the context of this, identity is complicated. Racial identity is complicated. Just because you belong to one racial group does not mean you agree with every fucking person in that racial group. And by the way, the racial groups that are divided here, Hispanic, that's an imposition. That's not something that came out of the Hispanic community. There is no Hispanic community as an existing material thing. It is created by sort of the way we measure things. But like, is there a Hispanic community? Really? Like, I won't talk about Hispanic community because I'm not a member of that community, so I'm not concerned with their knowledge. But I'll say like, people will talk about like the Jewish community, but it's not like we get along super good. Well, sometimes Jews are real mad at each other and don't like one another shit. I imagine that's true in other communities as well, since that's been true in literally every community I've ever been in. And so I think that like one of the important things that this gets at is like intragroup differences matter. Intragroup differences are present. Like you really should not be assuming all that much about a person just because of the demographic characteristics they have, because even if they, for example, oppose deportation, like there's a gap here that might just not come up in friendly conversation, stuff like that. Okay. This is what I want to go over with immigration. Let's take one or two more topics. What seems interesting? Yeah.
Alcohol and drugs.
Alcohol and drugs. It's almost the weekend, baby. Pretty safe. Notice, by the way, this is alcohol and drinking. I'm just going to take a second to define drugs because I confess I find drugs much more legally interesting than alcohol. So alcohol and drinking. Drugs, recreational. Will you guys mind if we do that too? Alright, let's do both. We'll do both. We'll start with alcohol and drinking. Alright. You have occasion to use alcoholic beverages, such as liquor, wine, and beer. What a phrasing. Do you have an occasion to use? This is a weird way to put this. This is a reminder, and just before you go, the quiz is most likely to be on the 28th. I think it's about a 90% certainty on the 28th of this month. I think there's about a 10% chance of the 30th of this month. So just a heads up about that. Here we go. No, it's just a quick reminder. A couple students had asked me about this. I mentioned this last class, but it's a new day. It's a new time to remind you. So the 28th is the most likely. Okay. It looks like basically the occasions for having a drink have stayed pretty steady, right? It's there's a little bit of noise in the walk, but it's right around 61 to 62%. Like that's the rough area. Has drinking ever been a cause of trouble in your family? That's a fun graph. Man, shit gets haywire in 72. Have y'all seen those graphs about like worker productivity and wages and how they decouple in 72? I don't know. Maybe it's the case that like there's something going on with alcohol too. My guess, by the way, is that we just don't have a lot of measurement in that earlier period, and that spike is almost certainly, we can discover this now. So measurement here, measurement here, measurement here, and then measurement here. And like, yeah, 12 to 22 seems like a lot, but again, we're talking about small numbers, so I don't think like, I think that probably these numbers are more accurate than these numbers, I will say, but this seems about right. I'm not sure there's actually a lot in this trend line, is part of what I'm saying. Yes, drink, the other thing. Do notice, by the way, the steady shrink of these numbers. Like it's a gradual shrink, but it is a steady shrink. Y'all don't drink. Like, y'all don't drink. That's what's going on here. This is almost entirely about age cohort. If you broke this down by age cohort, what you would see is that olds like me keep drinking as much as our fragile bodies will allow us to, which in my point is none, like virtually none. I will die, I'm so old. But like, y'all don't drink at all. Y'all never pick up the habit. And so that's what's driving this. So alcohol is really driving this. Alcohol ever been a cause of trouble in your family? They don't measure over the pandemic, which, if I'm being honest, you probably will have got some really interesting data there. I don't know which way it would have gone. People were drinking a lot more during the pandemic. There were more family problems, but I think a lot of people also thought that the drinking helped, even though you had an uptick in family problems. When did you last have a drink? Again, like drop-offs, but it's about that. I want to see. These numbers are fairly steady too. So the drinking is fairly steady. You guys want to talk about drugs?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's about what I would have guessed. I haven't looked at this set before, but that's about what I would have guessed. I was talking with a student, by the way, recently, and I was like, I'm sort of used to like a certain percentage of messages being high, but I feel like that's not happening as much anymore. And they were like, oh, definitely so. So smoke them if you got it. The one thing I'll say, and I don't want to take any people's stances on drugs because I don't care, it's my body. But I have been told by people who I trust that if you study high, you should also take the test high, because the studying links into your mental state, and so you want to. So I don't know what you're doing at home, but like just make sure whatever state you're in while you're studying is what you're doing while you're taking the test, because you probably do better. And I just want you to do well in the test, right? I just want you to do well in the test. So, yeah. Half asleep. Honestly, I mean that's the way to go. You got a little adrenaline going. Okay. So it seems like people are more comfortable with hot. That conforms with what I would have expected here. The numbers bear this all out. Exactly what you would expect. A drop off in how much drug use is a problem. It used to be much more of a problem, 58 and 7, here 39 and 14. Those are top line numbers, but like the trend line's pretty good. People think that this is less of a problem. Bunch of fucking liars taking the survey. Is it liars that's taking the survey, or is something else going on? This is not, by the way. Okay, so yes, have tried, taken the survey, 44%. Ever happened to try marijuana? You can see these numbers, even just from 2013, you see a doubling of the number of people who smoke marijuana. I don't know, by the way, if anyone's a real stickler and enters and like gets a survey is like, I only vape, I don't smoke. You know, edibles only. My lungs are so I don't know if that's going on. The phrasing was a little weird. But what you see is a consistent sort of increase in comfort with cannabis. Do you yourself eat marijuana edibles? Sure. I want to see more drugs though. That's what I want. Now, this is, who cares about nicotine? What about the problem of drugs? What? They don't have. It's just marijuana. Boo! I want to see more stuff on more fun drugs. All right. I'm exactly.
I want to see the data on Fen.
I'm precisely touching myself. I'm exactly where I want. One more key topic. 203. Let's do one more.
Well, maybe for some people.
Why would we lie? Okay, but we keep coming to this. I'll go to that. E is for education. I know that because I've done it. All right. There's going to be a lot of different stuff. I just don't know what's in. I'm going to stay here so I can actually like read this stuff as well, so I'm not constantly turning around. This looks very steady to me. Like there's a little bit of a drop off here, but that could easily, like, it would not surprise me to sort of random walk back up. I'm not sure if this stuff post 2019 is actually telling us any information. Maybe it is because it's mirrored in the opposite stuff, but I'm not sure about that.
Drop off though, that's right where COVID is, so it's like, of course, not everyone is satisfied with K through 12 education after that point.
But maybe, but the numbers don't line up that way, right? 2019, 51%, 2020, which is when we hit COVID, is 50%, and then 2021 is 46%. The big stuff doesn't come until after the pandemic is really, I mean, we're sort of in a pandemic. But like the pandemic is in being like vaccines are popularized, people are doing their stuff by late 2022. You get more of a drop there than during the early COVID. COVID might be part of it. I don't mean to discount that, but if so, it's part of a larger series of trends and not the single standalone trend driving this because the trend line precedes what we would expect to see from COVID. Yeah.
Could it not be the case of like high school who are finally getting out of high school where they feel the effects of their
Maybe, but like keep in mind, high schoolers leave, but then middle schoolers come up and need high school. So maybe what we're seeing is basically pissed off high schoolers who were trying during high school COVID. I don't know though, like my kid was in first grade for COVID, and as bad as high school has been, I'm sure it was awful. Trying to get a 7-year-old to use Zoom school 6 hours a day also had its downsides. I wouldn't immediately buy it. Here's what I'll say. I'm convincible that COVID is the explanation, but I need more evidence than what's here. The chronology is present enough that I would need more evidence, but don't instantly think it's wrong. I would need more evidence to see this. These numbers are going to line up. Polsci, the numbers in the somewhat incomplete, and the somewhat numbers are pretty steady as well. Public school confidence, a little fall off. What you see is a shift from quite lots to very little. So you're seeing a little bit of a shift within, and that might be the larger trend line because I'm seeing that pick up earlier. We're starting to get that even by the mid-10s, shifts within to like some to very little, starts to grow. So like you're seeing a little bit of shifting within there. Yeah.
I think a lot of it would have to do with smartphones, and how the awareness is increased over the years and how it is communication.
Oh God, maybe. Look, here's what. If it's smartphones, what I would say is it's not just going to be like the smartphone itself, but rather the smartphones having had a broader effect on our social practices and educational practices and communal practices generally. Maybe so. But if so, it's going to be so disparate and going to be like, the presence of a smartphone, presence of friends with smartphones, families with smartphones. Like, there's going to be so many little parts of that that will be really hard to disaggregate piece by piece. But it could be the case. I suspect that we have not yet really seen what the shift over to having a smartphone looks like, and I think that that's actually going to be like a really big shift in human community building. Like, I think that's probably going to be a hard shift to overstate. I want to say a couple other things. These are all so broad. There we go. What do you see here? There's a trend line away from public schools. Like, it's not huge, but it's meaningful. You start to get a big drop off at 2020. I would guess, by the way, that significant drop off there really is COVID. If I was going to look at a COVID chart, this is actually the COVID chart. Is that I think a bunch of parents pulled their kids from public schools in COVID or right around COVID, and then decided that they did not want to go back. I think that this is actually, if I was going to look for a COVID education chart, this is what I would work for. As a parent myself, I don't say this because I have special authority. I just mean like I have slightly different experiences that I bet a bunch of people around you can do. I can tell you that like on the parent chats that I'm on with like my kids' schoolmates' parents, a lot of them are talking about like we want to stay in public schools, we want to leave public schools, and it's less about specific stuff around COVID and more about that like when COVID happened, a lot of parents found themselves having to look for different educational opportunities, and a bunch of them found something that they liked. And so it's just sort of, you got more of an infrastructure, you got an increase in interest, and some people just stayed. So it's less like, I think the schools fucked up COVID, and it's more like, oh, I hadn't really thought about this, but as it turns out we have some different options now I'm thinking about it. So this is the thing that I would actually point to with COVID as like a pretty plausible explanatory. The one thing I'm not going to show you, I'll talk about it real quick, is I'm not going to show you any polls about foreign affairs, foreign policy. That's because those are wildly, like those are all over the place. Americans don't know anything about this. Like American public opinion when it comes to foreign policy is just cuckoo bananas. And there's no steadiness to it. It's literally all like, who was the last country that we heard didn't like us, and then we don't like that country for 3 months. Yeah. Take us on.
Yes, I was just looking at especially for this year with the public versus private and the rise from 8 to 12% private, could that not also be attributed in part to Trump's education budget cuts and that in practice will being more rewarded?
It's possible. I don't think there's a very specific reason why I think that's probably not true. First, I don't think that those are actually hitting the budgets yet. Like it's just the time is not quite there. And the thing that I would really look at is the rise of charter schools, which precedes this. What I would say, the way I would complicate what you're saying, I think you're picking up on something real. I just don't think it's fully expressed in the data yet. What I would say is that Trump is building off of an existing trend towards charter schools, and that he is leveraging that. We should expect to see that number go up in the future if the mechanism that you're pointing to is correct, which I think it might well be. Like, I think that that's a perfectly plausible mechanism. But the budget stuff hasn't actually hit yet, and there's going to be a lag between when the budget stuff hits and parents actually notice it. So I would think like an 18 months to 2 year lag to a real showing up in the data, but I think it's absolutely plausible that we'll see it in that data. I think that this trend line is pointing to something real. This is not part of that, this is not around the wall. There is in fact something going on here. And probably it's going to be multi-causal, and changes in funding models will be part of it. All right, I can keep going through this stuff forever, but like class comes to an end at some point. I hope this was useful and interesting.